Here's a guy breaking world records, taking 2 days off a week. Why don't I try it? And so I tried it, and it works great. If somebody's listening and they're like, oh, I'm going to apply this, here's the trick. Everybody thinks it's about the 5 days of loading. It's not. It's about the minimum 2 days of back-to-back recovery. It's a recovery strategy. It's not a loading strategy. There's a difference between metabolic health and metabolic fitness. And I lacked metabolic fitness. So it's not your ability to tolerate tempo or to work on your functional threshold. It's your ability, it's really your health, your mitochondrial function. And Lactate gives you a little insight into that. This active readiness test is just a situation where, if I'm unsure, it can help me. Because most of our days as athletes, it's not a red light or a green light. It's normally kind of somewhere in between. And I'm just trying to gauge how my fatigue is.
Welcome to the TrainingPeaks CoachCast. I'm your host, Dirk Friel. In each episode, we'll sit down with industry experts to discuss coaching methodologies, the latest research, and leading tools for endurance training. Visit trainingpeaks.com for more training and coaching resources. My guest today is Gordo Byrn, who has been called the Tony Robbins in a Speedo because he is a self-help guru who is also an ex-pro Ironman athlete with 7 sub-9 hour Ironman finishes. Gordo is also a past winner of the Ultraman triathlon in Kona, Hawaii. He is a coach and author of the book Going Long, and I first met and worked with Gordo in the late 90s. He has since taken time off and is now focused on being fit after 50, yet the lessons he teaches can be applied to any athlete at any age. Thanks for listening to the CoachCast, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Gordo Byrn. All right, Gordo, welcome to the CoachCast. It's been actually quite a long time, and we were just chatting, and the last time I saw you was on snow at this little mountain called Eldora outside of Boulder. So yeah, welcome to the CoachCast.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Trying to think about like when we really kind of like first met each other, but it's more around the late 90s, I suspect, around Ultra Fit days. And
Exactly.
we had a coaching group led by my father, and it was Ultra Fit Associates. And I think what was great back then was just literally like we were all just sharing, knowledge, and I think that was such a great time to kind of like learn, set foundations, move forward. And you've kind of obviously kept that going. You share, you document every single day in your life now. So I want to say thank you for doing that. For those that don't really know, Gordo was a pro triathlete, won Ultraman. You were a regular sub-9 hour Ironman athlete, like 7 times, I believe. Ironman Canada victory, New Zealand as well, I believe.
Well, second in both of those.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, almost. But, and then you kind of stepped away from it. So tell us about why you stepped away for a while and then that transition and, what are you doing now in terms of this comeback in your 50s?
Okay. So I think like a lot of folks our age, older folks, when we were younger, we had a lot more time to devote to sport. And what I found was I've got 3 kids and they were all born relatively close together. And as they kind of moved into those preschool toddler years, the fatigue from my training, I was just an awful parent when I was really tired. I mean, it's difficult when you're fresh.
Yeah.
But when you're blown after a long day, it's just a real struggle not to become part of the problem. And so I made a decision. At the time, I thought I was just taking a break for a year, and it ended up being a decade off racing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting time back just before the pandemic hit. So about 3 years ago. And then the pandemic hit and all our lives went crazy and the races all shut down. So I had to postpone it. But something I noticed was my metabolic fitness was declining. So I was starting to, it was almost like, you feel old. It's like you don't have the stamina. My power was still good. I was still strong, but I just got really tired on my long days. coming from an ultra background,
Yeah.
Ultraman, Ironman, it was really weird for me to lose something that had been a strength. And so that prompted me to decide, you know what, I'm going to try and just get back into shape and see what happens. And part of that process, a big motivator for me is hopefully I'll be able to show some of the other parents out there that if you take a break and you stay consistent, you're going to be able to come back. I think many parents have this fear that if they let it go a bit, first they worry that their body shape's going to totally change and they're going to get fat and get out of shape and all that. That didn't happen. That was a false belief of mine. But they worry that they'll never be able to get back
Mm-hmm.
to a good level. So what I'm hoping is over the next few years, I'll be able to demonstrate that yes, you can get back to a good level. And I think that'll give people comfort, people that are younger than me, people that have young kids, where the sport becomes a stressor in their life as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the sport being something enjoyable in their life. And so
Yeah.
that was the big motivator. And then once I got into it, I mean, I had 10 years off running and 10 years off swimming,
Mm.
and I really missed it. And I made a few mistakes coming back. And as you mentioned, I document those to try and help people come back more effectively. So we don't come back too strong, burn out, and then have a false start and have to restart. And we get into this lack of consistency. And so really just sharing that part of my story to help other people that want to change the direction of their life using athletics.
Yeah, I can definitely feel that as well. I mean, my wife and I made a conscious decision that I would retire, and start a family. And that was kind of a black and white moment, and literally it just happened. And but we planned it. And then I was like, I basically did like 5 hours a week, you know,
Yeah.
those early years, and just like took it, as it happened. And you just had to just let it slide by. And what used to be there wasn't anymore. But I just kind of, did a little 5 hours a week, and then as I gained back more time, um, I guess like it became lessons learned from the past, and what could you then improve upon from mistakes in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's, I think, really fascinating with what you're doing as well. You're relating it to what you did, more than a decade ago,
Yeah.
and the changes that you see now, and you're learning from other coaches. So I'd love to dig into some of
Yeah.
those fundamentals of, maybe the foundation may still be there, but the way you attack it or the way you interpret things, are different, and how you're applying that to your training now. So if we dig into some of the fundamentals, and first of all, every single one of these kind of topics we'll go over today are already documented. They're on your YouTube channel. They're on Substack. I highly recommend listeners go and, you even have these short 8-minute type YouTube videos that go into some of this stuff that's really pragmatic. You can apply today. And one such topic I saw was you talked about, build bottom up fitness.
Yeah.
So, what does that mean? How do you interpret that? How do you apply that to your training today?
So bottom up is something that's been there that I noticed very early in Ironman. And the nice thing about these long events is if you have a gap in your approach, it'll become apparent. I mean, if the day is just too long
Yeah.
for things not to become apparent, and the gap, the two gaps that are most apparent for most people will be they haven't trained themselves how to eat, and they haven't trained themselves how to pace. So eating and pacing, and then they lack stamina. And by stamina, I mean the capacity to simply do the amount of work required in the event.
Right.
So in cycling terms, it's a kilojoule limit.
Yeah.
So they don't have the ability to do the work at any speed.
Right.
So what happens is they break down, they end up walking, they're reloading their body's kind of catching up. So when I say bottom up, I mean, at the most basic level, it's the ability to move for the duration of your goal event, not not even swim, bike, run. It's just the ability to move. And if we think about, if the average Ironman is, say, about 13 hours, hardly anybody stands for 13 hours nonstop.
Right.
So what I would encourage, what I would say is, first you just have to get the ability to move that much in a day. Then the next step onto that is to do the amount of work required for your event. And again, if in these long events, it's a tremendous amount of work done in one day compared to the average day. Yeah. And the way I like to have athletes, and let's just use a marathon because that's something most people can relate to. So we're talking about 26 miles of running. And I say, well, look at your program, looking back for the last, say, 90 days. And on average, how long does it take you to do 26 miles of running? And that's going to be a number of days. So it's going to be, for most people, it's going to be anywhere from about, say, 4 to 14 days. And what I say is, once you have the capacity to do the work, try and compress the time frame that you're doing the work in. Mm-hmm. And then in between these compressions, you're going to be doing active recovery strategies. So that's the overall idea. So first, duration, next, the work. And then the cherry on top is what everybody tends to focus on first, which is work capacity training, which is what almost everybody defines as fitness. But it's fitness divorced from performance, because if you don't have the ability just to endure across the total event, to do the total amount of work, you're getting ahead of yourself. Yeah. And so this is there's a Norwegian coach, Olaf Alexander Boo, and this is something he stresses, and it's nice to hear these themes repeat with elites today. And he stresses, build the general capacity before building the specific capacity. And it's something that your dad taught all of us many years ago. We just called it base training. Mm-hmm. And everybody was always in a rush to try and get to their specific capacity training, which we called the build block. And they didn't do enough base. And the thing with base training is you can do it for 5 years and just throw in some low priority races, and you're going to consistently improve. You're going to enjoy your training. You're going to have much lower risk of illness and injury. So that's an emphasis. Now, comparing the past with now, I would say the number one change that I've noticed in the coaching community is this focus on adaptation. Joe was way ahead of all of us with a focus on adaptation. Joe used to say, look, I want you to do the minimum amount of training to get the result we're trying to get. And, that one.
He always said, do the minimum, least amount, most specific at the right time.
Exactly. And I was like, who wants to do that? Like,
I want to go hard. I just want to go hard.
Exactly. I was a total load. I call it load maxing. I was a load max athlete.
That's the majority.
Yeah. I want to give my body the absolute maximum that it can handle. And being an Ironman athlete, that is a heck of a lot of volume.
Yeah.
And so the change, so then to now. So now everybody's still doing a ton of volume. But really what they're doing is they're using the tools, the physiological testing, the passive and active metrics, and what they're ensuring is that they're actually getting something for their work. So they're focused on the adaptation. Are we getting an adaptation? Because if we're not getting an adaptation, all we're doing is making ourselves tired. Now, 20 years ago, we would say the same thing, but we would talk about it with regard to intensity. So the use of VO2 max type training, very hard training, severe domain it's called now. And I noticed that many endurance athletes were doing far too much of this training relative. So they were getting themselves tired from their intense training as opposed to getting themselves tired from their specific training, but it's specific in an endurance sense. And I think we quite often, when we talk about specific capacity, we default towards velocity at VO2 max or these higher intensities that are easy to measure. And we think that that has a link to our event. Well, if our event is a 5-minute time trial, it probably has a pretty good link. But if our event is a crit race or even a standard distance, triathlon, and certainly when we're going way out to 70.3 distance triathlon, marathons, these longer events, it doesn't have much to do with these shorter metrics, which are easy to measure. And so we can be optimizing for the wrong metric or optimizing for the wrong thing. So it's important to remember specific capacity is specific relative to the demands of the goal event.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole general versus specific is it's so difficult to internalize and really believe in. And you've spoken before about compounding works,
Yeah.
and time is your ally. And it's, I gain that strength from you and your content that you're pumping out, because time is your ally, compounding works, take the long game. And you can see that then build momentum, right, over time. But you have to first trust, believe in it, and not get the cart before the horse, per se, right?
Yeah. And the interesting thing about this adaptation approach is it actually gets you more volume over time.
Mm.
And that, I think, is the leap of faith. It's learning that, hey, if I preemptively back off in terms of structured recovery, both within my month, my season, and my week, I'm going to end up doing more work over the next 1,000 days. So I'm going to get more done. I'm going to have less illness. I'm going to have less interruptions, less small injuries, all this stuff.
Yeah.
But our brains are not good. I mean, in an Ironman, if we ask each other, Dirk, how are you going to feel 5 hours from now? I mean, I got no idea how I'm going to feel 5 hours from now, let alone trying to map out, well, how am I going to feel next week if I get carried away in my session today?
Right.
And to help athletes, what I say is pay attention to the sources of the fatigue. So, because you're going to be able to remember what you did 1, 2, 3 days ago. You can use your TrainingPeaks to see the TSS that tipped you over the edge, how high was last week. And if you're tracking it week to week, you're going to be able to see these fatigue patterns and recovery patterns, and you're going to be able to set ceilings and you're going or floors in terms of if you're thinking about training stress balance. I'm never going to take myself below X because I know if I go below, it's not going to be worth it. I'm just going to have to rest extra 3 days from now.
Right.
And likewise, as an older athlete, I'm finding my fatigue cycles are extending. So if I'm tired this week, it's not the session I did 48 hours ago. It's something that happened last week. And likewise, when I rest, I don't actually feel a whole lot better the next day or something. When I have a lighter week, there's a delay on it. So there seems to be, and I don't know if this is because I've been taking a break or if it's I'm getting older, but I think each athlete will have their own fatigue and recovery cycle. And that's something that I like the metrics within TrainingPeaks. I can look at that and try and learn what is the cycle, what we're dealing with. Because my daughter is a kind of regional class swimmer. She's a 14-year-old teenager, and she can put herself in this huge hole.
Yeah.
36 hours later, she's trending back up again.
Yeah.
If I tried to do something like that, it's 10 days easy.
Right.
And so depending on the athlete profile, you can decide on how deep you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're actually putting a framework to this. I mean, you've spoken about the 5-2 kind of structure of loading and recovery, and that works for you, but explain what the 5-2 is, where that came from. There's a great story behind, where we found that, but tell us more about the 5-2 loading.
So it's actually kind of neat, the background of that. So there's a Swedish speed skater called Niels, and he broke the world record and won some gold medals. And his protocol, he would do five days on, 2 days off. Mm-hmm. And so he would always have 2 days back to back. And he wrote a book called How to Skate a 10K. And if you Google that, you'll get right to his website. And it's a great read.
Yeah.
I think all of us were talking about it when it came out. And my issue historically has been I don't do a good job at scheduling recovery. And so I was like, here's a guy breaking world records, taking 2 days off a week. Why don't I try it? And so I tried it, and it works great. Now, when you apply, if somebody's listening and they're like, oh, I'm going to apply this, here's the trick. Everybody thinks it's about the 5 days of loading. It's not. It's about the minimum 2 days of back-to-back recovery. It's a recovery strategy. It's not a loading strategy. And at 54 years old, I can't load for 5 days in a row. I mean, I'll tip myself over the edge. So my actual rest is more than 2 days a week. Okay. But in every single week, I've got 2 light days back to back, and it gives me a mental reset. I stay on top of the rest of my life. And it's just like, you kind of get that mental relaxation. And it's worked really well for me. And so again, it's not a loading cycle, which everybody focuses on. I'm going to hammer myself for 5 days and just hope for the best on the 2 days. That's not it. You do your normal training. You get additional compression because with the 2 easy days, you can compress a bit more into the 5 days. So perhaps there's a bit more overload within the 5 days, but then you've got the 2 light days. And when you need it, you take more rest days on top. Niels's book has an appendix in it, which lays out all his daily training leading up to the Beijing Olympics over years. And I did some analysis, and his actual rest, so if it's a 5-2, you'd expect about 9 days a month. His actual rest was significantly more than that. Huh. So even at the elite level, he gave himself permission to rest more than his protocol. Results were absolutely exceptional. And I think that's an important thing for athletes to be aware of, in that if you're not looking at the data of your favorite elite and understanding and be really able to dig into that, if you're not able to dig into that for the data, don't assume that what they're saying they're doing is actually what they're doing. So don't take these strategies and just drop them into your life and wonder why they don't work. There might be a piece of the puzzle that you're not aware of. Now, to understand Niels's protocol, I actually connected with his coach, and his coach is now my coach. So I was like, you know what? This guy has had exceptional results. I can definitely learn something from his coach, Johan. And so Johan was doing a swim run event called Otilo in Sweden. So we did a little bit of a coaching exchange where I had won that event many years ago, and he was getting ready for it. So I was like, okay, I'll help you get ready for your event, and you can help me get back into shape. And so it's been a really great relationship between the two of us.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, when you think about the focus being on the recovery, I mean, personally within my training, I've thought about, okay, my threshold, right? Trying to optimize threshold. That's another thing around the Norwegian kind of, discussions these days. And like when I think about 80-20 concept, and I'm thinking like, okay, every 5th day should be my focus. That's like my threshold day, And so nothing can compromise that 5th day. So whatever volume I'm adding in, it's okay as long as that 5th day I'm ready to go for that threshold, workout, because I'm not going to compromise it. So it's maybe a little different way of looking at it in terms of, what I'm trying to optimize, but then I'll optimize the rest up to that point.
Yeah, I got 2 ideas there.
Yeah.
So on 80-20, everybody has a different definition. So I think if you really, what we're talking about is it's a different way of expressing what Joe taught us many years ago, which was breakthrough training.
Right. Yeah. BT.
So exactly. So you're going to have your specific capacity workout, whatever that is for your event.
Yeah.
You want to be ready for that workout. The other thing I would say is 80-20. Is it 80-20 on time? Is it 80-20 on load, like on TSS
session
points?
I think about sessions, not time.
Exactly. And I think Dr. Sam Milan talks about that too. He splits it based on sessions as well. Yeah. Now, what I've found is I'm actually more, when I actually dig into my data, I'm more 90-10.
Uh-huh.
And my 90% is my green zone training, my easy, steady work, and my 10% is everything else. Now, here's another thing. If you're a multi-sport athlete, your tolerance for intensity is going to vary by sport. So you're going to actually have a blended intensity on your week. In the terms of most of us, particularly when your volume gets up, swimming is a sport where we can work at what feels like a relatively high intensity at times, but we'll tolerate it much better than, say, trying to run very intensely, which will break down many athletes. So you need to be aware of the mix. And then you also need to be aware of the impact of strength training within the overall mix too. And if you're doing things like plyometrics, they might be a small amount of time, but create quite a bit of fatigue within the athlete. So I think the polarized discussion has been useful. And I think the most way it's been useful for athletes is it's encouraged them to slow down their endurance training. So instead of always trying to like bump that speed up and ending up in this high zone 2, low zone 3 using a 5-zone system, they actually back it off and they get their endurance training more zone 1, zone 2, low 2, kind of around that lactate turn point, that first lactate turn point. Yeah. And I think part of the reason it works is that's a much more effective place to target the endurance training.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to dig into more of that in a bit, but I kind of want to go back in time a bit here. You talked about, I guess, looking at your metrics, but more specifically, you think of it as your readiness, right? Readiness score, readiness matrix. You have this kind of protocol that you've been applying every single morning, it sounds like. What are you tracking? What do you do? What decisions does it help you make?
Okay. Well, the great thing about the devices now is I track everything, and everything gets pushed up to TrainingPeaks automatically. I don't have to do a thing. So that's great. So I'm going to track my morning resting heart rate seated. I'm also tracking my evening resting heart rate. So before I go to bed, I want to track what my evening resting heart rate is seated, same position. And I want to see what the gap is. That lets me see how much the day took out of me. Now, when I do both of those samples, it's going to also capture my heart rate variability. And so that's also captured as well. So heart rate variability. So those are the two, if you like, I call them passive metrics because I'm seated. Then I have an active, what I call a active readiness. And I got the test. It's a test that Niels did and Johan had developed with Niels, a Swedish active readiness test. There's versions of it floating around the world. And really what we're trying to do is I hop on the bike and I'll give you my numbers and you can interpret it to yourself. So let's say my first lactate turn point is at 200 watts. So I'm going to be training below that. So I'm going to do 6 minutes at 150 watts, 6 minutes at 165 watts, and 6 minutes at 180 watts. So I don't even come up. I don't even leave zone 1. And no matter where I am in my cycle, in my training cycle, in my macro cycle, that's always going to be an easy effort for me. And the idea is to capture the heart rate response at a very easy effort. What does my heart rate do? What does my body do as I start to exercise? And the hypothesis is that if I'm a little too tired, we call it the heart rate handbrake. So my heart rate will not come up and it's going to stay suppressed. And so I'm going to have a normal heart rate response for that. And if I'm super fresh and I'm coming off an easy week and in my mind, I know I'm getting ready to do a really tough session, my heart rate's going to rev up because my body's like, let's do it. And so I have this fresh profile and I have my normal profile. It's like, hey, it's just another training day. And then I have this tired profile and I have this, really tired profile. This is like super easy day or off. And so by doing this test, you just get a look. Now the test is really just one piece of information. It's one piece of the overall picture. So that's why I'm capturing everything. So I've got my soreness. How's my nutrition going? Am I patient with my kids? That's a big one for me. If I lose patience at home, it's like, all right, something's up.
Yeah, your mood.
I've got a mood issue kind of going on here. But this active readiness test is just a situation where, if I'm unsure, it can help me. Because most of our days as athletes, it's not a red light or a green light. It's normally kind of somewhere in between. And I'm just trying to gauge how my fatigue is. And if it was a day like you talked about, so a key session for you is going to be your threshold day. Well, if it's a threshold day, I'm going to put that at the beginning of my microcycle, and I'm going to make sure that I'm getting all green lights before I do that workout. And I'm going to delay or skip that workout if I'm not getting the green lights across all my metrics, because I don't want to rev my engine hard when my body's not ready to absorb the training. So coming back to this concept, this newer concept of focusing on adaptation, this is where the metrics can be really helpful. 15 years ago, I'd go out and train 7 hours, and then I'd come back and I'd send an email off to my coach saying, hey, my heart rate was suppressed today. What do you think?
Yeah.
And by then
After
it's
the
too
fact.
late.
Yeah, right.
I've done it.
Yeah.
And so you end up kind of chronically run down. So what the metrics enable us to do is they enable us to be, I call it dynamic loading. We can be much more dynamic in our approach to stressing our bodies, and we wait until our body is ready to receive, or more ready to receive, the stress. We don't just throw it on, and if we get too tired, well, we're going to have to rest more days. And this is the concept of load you can absorb, but also more specific load over time. It all kind of works together.
Yeah, and that's the compounding as well. Like if you can, right, buy low, sell high. Right? Why buy high, sell low? Like let's put the work in when we're ready. We'll get that compounding effect, recover from it, get a better, super compensation afterwards. And so that dynamic loading is definitely kind of like this trend that's coming in. And you said, like, you can't put yourself in a hole per se, if you really,
and you need to understand that, the improvement, the adaptation, it's not really up to me. It just, it's up to my body and how my body's coping. Now, what can I do to improve that? I can use my active recovery strategies, and I can take the rest of my life stress as low as is practical. Now, again, I'm living with 3 kids. I've got other stuff going on.
dynamic.
It's a different thing. Yeah. You just got to roll with it. And this is the key thing, a friend of mine, Alan Cousins, had a concept he's writing a book online on a Substack, and he had this concept of breakpoint volume. So you're going to have this amount of load, and at some point it's not going to work for you. You're going to tip off, and the more things we have going on in our lives, and as we get older, this breakpoint is going to be coming down on us, and we just accept it. It's just the way it is. And I like the metrics because the metrics take some of the pressure off me. I used to write my plan out weeks in advance, and I would always do my plan. And this more dynamic approach is a more flexible approach. And when I'm tired, it's okay. I'm not breaking the rules by resting. And I find it fits with my life a lot more.
Well, I think you're also describing like the value of a coach. Like, this is something that you can be dynamic with, with expert instruction and with somebody that has experience, and to help you design some of these readiness matrix and metrics to track, but then to kind of make that decision on the fly, and have somebody to work with to help make those decisions, so
before we move on, I just want to touch on that too.
Yeah.
It's really easy to make this quite complicated. And if you're an athlete that's prone to overcomplicating things, if you just pay attention to the first 2 things I said, morning heart rate, evening heart rate, and then if you add on top of that your normal training heart rates for the effort, that's going to give you almost all the information you need if you combine it with your mood. So you don't necessarily need to be building a complex algorithm to figure this out. And I think that might be part of the reason why some of the readiness scores with the wearables don't seem to work too well for people. They're overcomplicating the issue. You can just, your morning heart rate, you're going to have a range. Your evening heart rate, you're going to have a range. And if you're outside the range, either above it or below it, something's up. It's not a day to do a key day. Get yourself back in your normal range and then move forward. So don't overcomplicate it would be something I'd tell people.
Yeah. But you are overlaying that with your HRV data, and that's giving another data point. But how much do you rely on the HRV? Like, how concrete are you like placing decision on that?
So, well, here's the thing with HRV that I've noticed. It's variable. So I can take 3 samples in a 10-minute block, 3 2-minute samples in a 10-minute block, and move the entire way across my normal range. Okay. So it's not a reliable signal for me if I'm ready. Okay. So it's not a green signal. It is a very good signal if I'm not ready.
If you're outside that range.
Yeah. So if I'm suppressed if I'm suppressed below my normal range on it, and particularly I got an Oura ring, if my temperature is slightly elevated. So if I have a slight elevation in temperature, a suppression in HRV, I've been exposed to a virus and I might get sick. So it is very helpful for me to make less mistakes. And it's a loading mistake when I'm not aware that I'm about to get sick. And so last year, I'm certain, because my wife got sick and I didn't twice, I had that signal, backed right off for 48 hours, didn't get sick. And so that is great for an athlete, particularly an athlete that's pushing hard. A higher volume, a higher load athlete, and an illness can really set that athlete back. So it's very useful for that. The other thing it's useful is, and we use it with my daughter, is trends. So HRV trends over time. So her normal range is much wider than mine as a younger athlete, and the HRV will trend up when she's unloading and trend down when she's in a loading cycle. And the trends are quite good. Yeah. Now, depending on the type of loading, you and I know that if it's base training loading, it's green zone loading. Doing some loading when you're a little bit suppressed, a little bit tired, not a problem. Your body's going to be able to cope with that, providing you don't do it too long. So you overreach for a bit and then you'll be able to come back. So you can manage it that way. And we use it to not do supplemental training. So if you're wondering, can I get another session in? If the HRV trend is down, no, you're not going to be doing anything extra. We're going to try and get you trending back up. Also, between the microcycle and when you're in an unloading phase, you definitely want to see your HRV metrics trending up. If your HRV metrics don't trend up when you rest, I would argue that the overall program is too stressful for you. So the training load, the on weeks are too stressful, because when you're resting, you're seeing your metrics collapse. And that can be a sign, well, maybe the overall program, what I think is my normal range is actually a suppressed range.
Right.
And to see that at the end of the microcycle, what I recommend everybody does, and that'd be like twice a year for most of us, at the end of the skimo season, and then say the end of the bike season.
Yeah.
We're gonna unload, and we're gonna try and get a healthy baseline on all our metrics, our resting heart rates, our HRV. We're gonna go see the doctor, get our blood work done, and we're gonna understand what our healthy baseline is, because it's easy. I noticed this with myself. I had to back off at the end of February. Fatigue hits us so slowly and so gradually. If you're a highly motivated athlete, you can look like you're in your normal range, but your normal range is chronically suppressed on you. And if you don't have these unloading periods, I did a 14-day unloading period just to see what would happen. It turned out I was right. My mood was depressed, and I had just become chronically fatigued without realizing it. And then you come back from that, you feel so much better, and you go back into your training with a fresh kind of, you got your mojo back.
Yeah, that's a good point on HRV, kind of the trend. It's more about the trends than the absolute values, like day to day per se. What is your range, that normal range?
Yeah.
And those trends.
Yeah. Same thing with the active readiness test, by the way, too.
All right.
You'll find, you're after my 2 easy days, if my heart rate isn't coming up like it's fresh, then I'm not gonna be doing. If I had a hard session scheduled, demanding session scheduled for that first day of the microcycle, I'm
Yeah.
going to delay it till day 2.
Yeah.
And that's usually all it takes. So it's like 2 really light days and then an easy day, and then I'm good to go. And my body's going to respond much better from that stimulus just by delaying for 24 hours.
Yeah. No, I love those days when you go out and do that BT workout and heart rate's reacting and you're staying on
Yeah.
top of it and you're like, wow, this is how it's supposed to feel, you know? And, 2 decades ago, it was always the opposite. It was like, man, this is horrible. Like, I gotta be 20 watts higher than I am right now. God, so talking about intensity, right? Dialing in the intensity, you've stated most people are going too hard. They don't know it. You've experienced it in your comeback. You've talked about it on your run. You're running too hard and you found out that you were running too hard. You were biking too hard because of lactate testing.
Yeah.
And so pull us into your world of, you used to have a lab, but now it's a little more simplified, I believe.
Yeah.
But talk to us about how you're incorporating lactate testing into this comeback.
Okay. So a little bit of history. In 2000, I left my job in private equity in Hong Kong, and I had a month in Queensland, and then I went over to New Zealand, and in New Zealand, I ended up down in Christchurch, and down in Christchurch is a doctor called Dr. John Hellemans, who's a multiple world age group champion in triathlon, and he had coached world champions in 6 different disciplines, and now he's coached 7 different Olympians. Very, very experienced guy. And so his business was called Active Health, and it was a mixture of treating the community and treating the athletes within the community as well as coaching. And he taught me lactate testing. Now, back then, if you had a power meter and you knew how to lactate test, you were so far ahead of everybody, because everybody else was training basically blind. All they had was an old school polar heart rate monitor, and that's it. So they just had feel. They had no idea what was happening internally in their bodies. And today we know so much more about lactate and its role in the body. And I would recommend, if anybody hasn't listened to the CoachCast with Dr. Sam Milan, to cue that up, listen to that. He did 2 hours with Peter Attia about mitochondria, lactate, zone 2. I think it's called the zone 2 deep dive. Well worth your time to understand. And I typed up notes on what I heard on both of those podcasts, and you can find those on my website. So that's a little background. So I started training again at the end of April last year. And
so we're a year in now.
Yeah, we're coming up on my anniversary. And I'm like, there's this huge disconnect between the fatigue I'm getting and the heart rate I'm running. So I'm getting really, really tired from what seemed like low heart rate training for me. And I had taken a long break when our first child was born, and that I was 40 years old at the time. And so I had been through this before. And back then we had a human physiology lab in the basement of my house, Met cart, the whole thing. And so we were able to kind of plug me into the Met cart, do some lactate testing, do some gas exchange analysis, and figure out what was going on. And the answer was kind of obvious. I was metabolically unfit. So you can get an insight into your metabolic fitness. You don't need to go down to the local university. You can just do some lactate testing. So I jump on and get myself a lactate kit, and I have a look, and it was shocking how metabolically untrained I was. And my lactate was breaking. It was going up at 105 beats per minute. Mm-hmm. So basically, as soon as I went from a walk to a easy jog, my lactate would spike, and metabolically I was in zone 3. Wow. So I had no steady. There was no steady zone. I was right in the heavy domain. And it took months, about 6 months of running absolutely as easy as I could to develop easy pace. And I wasn't heavy. I had a medical because I had COVID last summer. The doctor said I was looking great. I was all medically cleared, but there's a difference between metabolic health and metabolic fitness. And I lacked metabolic fitness. And so for the athletes listening, I would say lactate testing gives you an insight into your metabolic fitness. So it's not your ability to tolerate tempo or to work on your functional threshold. It's your ability, it's really your health, your mitochondrial function. And lactate gives you a little insight into that. So same deal if you start swimming. Most amateur swimmers have no easy gear. They have no ability to swim metabolically easy. Now the bike is the best place. The bike's great because we have gears, and I know, and you might want to ride uphill all the time, but you're going to have to stay on the flat when you're training this. But it's easier now because we all got Zwift and stuff. But you can train yourself metabolically much more easy on the bike and dial it in. So I got my lactate kit and I started testing. Now, the common test is a ramp test, and most people will ramp you using fairly large steps. Yeah. So Dr. Sam Milan talks about 0.5 watts per kilo. Round numbers, I'm about 80 kilos. And that would be 40 watts a step. Yep. Now I'm going to jump across zones if I'm stepping up at 40 watts a step. Yeah. So I would say the other thing is his population of elite cyclists are leaner and fitter, right? Yeah. So their zones are bigger and they got less kilos to produce.
Their zones are wider. So we have less than 100 watts between zone 2 and 4, and they have quite a bit more.
Yeah. So if you're applying the protocol, and if somebody's out there listening, I would say, if you're going to make a mistake, make your steps too small, because the first point that you want to discover is this first lactate turn point. And if you've got a 40 watt gap and LT1 is anywhere within those 40 watts, that's too big for you. That's not going to be effective. So I will step up. If you remember, I was talking about my SART, my active readiness test. I'm stepping up 15 watts at a time. So when I'm trying to dial in LT1, I start really easy, 100 watts. I'm 100 watts below where I expect to find LT1. And I'm doing these small steps, 15 watts, 20 watts, and I'm coming up. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I'm warming my body up in the test. And so I'm not creating stress from starting at too high a thing. And I want to see my baseline. I want to see this baseline lactate coming along. And I want to have a clear idea when it's going to tick up on me. And so that LT1 point in the test, and I like to use either 5 or 10-minute steps. I'll use 5-minute steps if I'm going all the way up to max. So if I was doing a max protocol where I'm going to take it to the limit, I'm going to be doing 25 watt steps. I'm going to be doing them 5 minutes at a pop. And I got the Nova Biomedical lactate tester. So the first sample I'll take is at 4 minutes, and then I can get another sample in at about 4.5. And if I don't think my samples are accurate, I'm going to stay at the power until I think I got a good reading, because sometimes your sweat can contaminate.
Yeah, and you're taking the test. You're doing the test yourself on yourself.
All my testing's by myself until I teach one of my kids to be my lab tech.
Nice.
That's coming.
Awesome.
So, once you get used, that's why it's best to learn on submax. So I got a little tray beside my bike. Yeah. And I got a little tray beside my treadmill. So I've got everything all laid out, and I've done enough tests now over my life, and also recently I got my game on with the test, so I can self-test. Now, once you get much above zone 3 and you're getting towards that functional threshold, your sweat rate's up, you're starting to move around. It's a lot tougher to test. And so most of the testing I do is a submax test where I'm looking for this LT1 point. The other reason is if you're using functional threshold or you're using critical power, or using these higher bands, you can set those much easier by just doing power-based tests. The lactate I find is most useful at the low end to make sure the steady training is actually steady metabolically.
Right.
And so to dial in the endurance training. Now, a lot of folks, so that's the first test. So find that LT1 point. So let's say I discover my LT1 point is 200 watts, or someone goes to a lab and the tester says, well, LT1 is 200 watts for you. It's like, okay, great. But maybe you're in a cold room in your basement when you got tested, or maybe the lab conditions were different than the field conditions. Well, now what you have to do is you have to go out and test that. And if you're a cyclist, I would say the easiest thing to do is just jump on Zwift, because you can have all your testing equipment right beside you and do a 2-hour ride and have a look at your lactate every 20 minutes, holding at what the lab tells you is LT1. It should not be difficult for you. And you can see what happens to your lactate. The other thing you're going to learn, and this is the reason why I do my Swedish active readiness test, you're going to learn that if you slam straight into an endurance workout as an amateur, you're going to spike your lactate. I've seen lactates as high as 3.0. So that might be 1 to 1.5 millimoles above baseline because the athlete didn't warm up appropriately. So how do you know if your warm up is appropriate? Just do your normal warm up, take a baseline lactate, and take some samples while you're doing your warm up. And what you're probably going to discover is that your warm up needs to be a lot easier for your body, to bring your body online. And so you get the most out of your endurance training, and you're not making your endurance training more stressful than it needs to be. Same deal with running, by the way. Every single run I do either starts with my active readiness test on the bike or as 10 minutes of walking, followed by slow jogging, just to bring my body up and bring everything online. I don't just charge out of the garage. I live at the bottom of Flagstaff Mountain. So in the old days, I could charge, you roll down to the bottom of the alley, start climbing. So what I've found is that's not optimal. Yeah. What we need to do is kind of bring ourselves online. So you're going to be able to, so now we're talking 3 things that I would recommend the athlete test. Test your warm up, make sure you're actually warming yourself up. Use this progressive test to dial in this LT1 point, then get out in the field and test if it's the same in the field. Now, when you're doing the field test, that's going to let you dial in your heart rate zones, because a 5-minute sample or even a 10-minute sample is not going to get the heart rate response that a 1 hour or 2 hour or even longer, if you're a long distance athlete, you'll get a much wider heart rate response, and you'll learn what the normal heart rate response is. Now, within the lab test, or the test if you're a self-tested athlete, take the maximum heart rate that you see in the 5 minutes or the 10 minutes. Don't take the average. Yeah. If you take the average, you'll be in a 5-minute step, the average is going to way understate, because you'll see the heart rate's going to be climbing the whole time in the 5 minutes. That's why Dr. Sam Milan's advice to do these 10-minute steps I thought was excellent, because 10 minutes at the work rate, by the end of the 10 minutes, you're actually going to get a decent heart rate response, and you're going to be able to use that. Now, when you sit on that heart rate for a couple hours, it's going to be higher, probably about 5 beats higher. And so you need to allow a range, a normal range, and you'll see that. And the other thing is, with your endurance training, judge if the target is appropriate based on what happens afterwards. And what I mean is, it's not how you feel immediately after the workout, it's how you feel the day after. If you have unexplained fatigue from some test you did or the lab zone, you have to trust the fatigue. You've set your zone too high, and you got to back it off. So although we've been talking about my LT1 at 200, I do a lot of training where the average might be 165. And the reason for that is we don't ride a point when we're out there, and we don't run a point, and we don't swim a point. We have a range. Yeah. We have an effective range that we're sitting in. And what I would say is, you want to keep your power band, your pace band, so that you're not always spiking up into the heavy domain, into zone 3, and in some cases, even zone 4. I mean, if you look at an amateur's ride, a lot of times they're going to be going even over functional threshold quite a lot. Yeah. Those micro spikes, unless you have exceptional lactate clearance capacity, will fatigue you very quickly over time. And so you need to have that discipline. And this is something we learned when we hooked everybody up to power meters, and we could see they were just stomping all the time. And it's like, okay, you got to learn how to ride smoother so that you're not giving yourself all that additional stress.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things. How often do you test and versus confirm?
Okay. So right now I'm relatively new, so things are moving. Okay. So I'm testing at the beginning, when I started last year, I was testing every 6 weeks, and things were moving. They were moving in those. So now I'm coming up to a year. I'm testing at least every quarter to have a look at it. And I do different tests. If it's the submaximal test, so I can do what I call a test, but my lactate's not even going to get into zone 3. And by zone 3, I mean on the 5-zone system. So I'm not even, so I just want to see that LT1. And then, the other day I did my bike test, and then actually it was yesterday, did my bike test, had a little bit of water, analyzed the test, went out to the treadmill, did my treadmill test. So it was a total of 2.5 hours of exercise, but my lactate never went past 2.0.
Yeah. And
my baseline at the very beginning was 1.6. It was a little elevated, but it came down as I started to exercise. So that, and then the spot checks I do when I'm curious. If particularly you're going to be able to, once you get the LT1 dialed in with your lactate, you're going to be able to feel it. You're going to be able to feel the point. You're going to be able to feel your breathing deepen, not the tempo breathing that you're going to get with, zone 3, or the panting that you're going to get in zone 4, but you're just going to feel this little bit of deepening. People talk about the talk test and that. You're going to be able to sort of feel that. The test I use is I'm in zone 2 if I have to put my phone down. If I'm riding indoors, if it's zone 1, I can do whatever I want. When I'm in zone 2, I'm having to focus a bit, got to put the phone down. I'm kind of like doing my ride. And so that would be how often I would test. So after I do the breakpoint test, I'm going to do a field test. And then I'm curious what happens. I got 2 things I'm wondering about. What happens when I decouple? So I want to do a long endurance ride, start to decouple, and then see what my lactate is doing. I did an experiment, but I did it climbing. And so my heart rate decoupled. So I did a 2-hour endurance ride, and then I did a long climb, 1-hour climb.
Yeah.
And I tried to hit the gas on the climb. I fell apart, decoupled, and I sampled some lactate. My lactate wasn't up very much. So I decoupled with a low lactate response. And sometimes the low lactate response can be depletion. So I might have been depleted. So I didn't, because lactate is a source of fuel. So I'm just experimenting with that.
Are you tracking the decoupling values of the same course over time?
Well, it's actually what I look at is how long I can go without decoupling.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm still a relatively young athlete in terms of my return. So what I'm not trying to do is do a durability test where I might hit the gas and then see if I can come back. So what I want to do is I want to push my green zone 1, zone 2, I want to push that as far out in time before I start adding intensity on top of it. Now, as an elite, what we used to do was we used to be hitting the gas all the way, because what we would want to do is figure out how many surges or how hard we could hit the climbs in an Ironman and still be able to run well. And so we were trying to figure out what it would take to decouple us. And when the fitness is very deep, when the fitness is really deep, you just keep coming back after all these surges.
You have more matches.
Yeah, you can burn you can burn matches like kind of all day. It's a wonderful feeling, but I can't do that now. There's like no coming back. If I put in a hard surge, I'm kind of done for the day.
No,
but that's what I'm trying to build on.
I used to go, if folks know around Boulder, like Left Hand Canyon up to Ward, and but I would do that climb at a set watts. Yeah. Like zone 2, where I think it is, and then let's see what heart rate does. Yeah. And that's kind of it's a test in its own, no lactate, but is it, what kind of decoupling am I seeing on that course over time? Now, temperature, et cetera, can affect it. But, that was kind of a fun thing to do.
So let me throw out one test that I actually haven't heard anybody else talk about recently. There's been so much talk about lactate and zones and stuff with the success the Norwegians had. Now, if I was an elite cycling coach, I'm not, but if I was, there's a test that I would do. And I would, before I did a hard block with my athletes, I would want to confirm that they still have their high-end lactate capacity. In other words, I would want to make sure that when they hit the gas, they get a lactate response.
Yeah.
Because something that I found is, it was kind of called the lactate paradox or something, is that as the athlete is starting to get overreached and potentially going to make that transition from being overreached to overtrained, their top end, at first, they're still going to be able to produce the watts, but you're not going to see the lactate associated with those watts that you would normally do.
Right.
And it's going to feel hard. So I would want to make sure that when the athlete hits the gas, they get a normal lactate response. And that would be...
I think that's the difference between the Pogachars of the world. They can have this insanely high zone 2 level, but glycolytically, they have they have a whole nother gear as well.
Yes.
Whereas me, I who knows, a lot of pros might have relatively the same aerobic threshold, but they don't have that additional gear above that.
Yeah.
Which is so important in an anaerobic type sport like road cycling. You might go right from the gun in a 5 hour, or mountain biking. You got to go for the single track, 50 yards away from the gun in a 50-mile race, and you want to be in the top 10, right? You're going to redline it.
Yeah. And
so, glycolytically, you got to have that gear.
Yeah. And the 80% part of the program is what creates the lactate clearance capacity. I think that's a very important. Oftentimes we think we need the athlete to focus on their threshold. They do, but they also need to be able to use that lactate as fuel very quickly afterwards. And that's what you get from your endurance training. Otherwise, you're going to be done. So you're going to be at the front, but everybody's going to be going by you.
Exactly. In that mountain bike scenario, you might get a 1 minute, 90-second recovery, but how well do you recover in that 90 seconds, for the next 5-minute climb?
And I want to say something about swimming that's related to this for the triathlon coaches. Open water is about the ability to recover while moving. It's very much like a crit. And it's really important that you train this in yourself if you're an athlete, or if you're a coach. You need to train the athlete's ability to hit the gas and recover while moving at a pretty good pace. And many programs and many swim workouts don't train this capacity. They train the get out capacity and then they're on the wall. Get out capacity and then they're on the wall. Or it's easy swimming. And something that needs to be trained specifically, because it's a very specific adaptation, is this ability to hit the gas and then back off to a low zone 4 type effort, 5-zone system. So this ability to change speed within, because the pace is always changing in the water. And so people have great fitness, they have great get out capacity, but they get dropped a third of the way through the swim because there's a surge and they can't recover while moving because they haven't trained it. So that's a specific thing for triathlon.
Yeah, you're bringing back my days of criterium racing where I'm trying to recover in the corners. Oh, nasty. Okay, how about understanding effective range for endurance training?
So we talked about that. Again, TrainingPeaks and Zwift are both really good. What they'll do is they'll bin your ride. And by saying bin, I mean they'll put the watts and you can actually see. And so what you can do is with bin analysis, you can look at, okay, my standard endurance ride, am I doing what I think I'm doing? So you're going to have a heart rate response, but you're also going to have these power bins. And it normally looks like a pyramid. And you can look at what the range is. And this is why I prefer to target endurance training at first lactate turn point. Because what that means is the range is going to be a little over it and, say 1/3 over and 2/3 down. If we're looking at kind of this range that the athlete's riding on, and the range is not going to go into the heavy domain. There's going to be no tempo associated with it, because heart rate doesn't tell the whole story. So if you're an elite, these little surges are no big deal. For everybody else, the surges are a big deal. You don't want to be dealing with the surges. And you want to train this effective range. Now, the same principle applies to your tempo training. If you're doing long climbs and you're sitting and you think you're sitting in a zone 4, maybe you're a low zone 4 type heart rate, but if your power is constantly going over functional threshold, constantly nipping into the severe domain, going over critical power, you're going to be doing a very different workout than you think you are. Right. And so this bin analysis will let you look at, is your effective range in this domain, in this physiological area that you want to actually be addressing. And so if you find your training is generating more fatigue than you expected, it's probably because you're dipping into one domain higher and your effective range is wider than you think.
Yeah.
And so that would be how I would use that type of analysis for athletes.
Yeah. Sometimes as a coach, I would put a governor on the effort, and really like you could analyze it and see how much time was spent above X wattage.
Yeah.
Like you did this workout completely wrong. Like,
yeah,
you get rid of this extra watts, back it off, and hold a steady state.
And for the triathletes listening, what I say is, if you have a disappointing run, look at that bike file and chop the peak off the entire bike file. So chop the peaks off all the power, all those power spikes. You're going to get a number where you're like, if somebody has a functional threshold of say 300, I would say you never want to see a 3 until you're running great off the bike, for an example. But whatever your profile is, you're going to have to chop the peaks off, because the peaks are going to be what are killing your legs for the run, and it's not going to cost you much speed. So you're going to learn how to time trial properly by getting speed without peak power. And you're going to learn to manage the power across the course much better without these peak surges.
Yeah. And you're describing variability index, which is VI in TrainingPeaks. When you highlight a section or that entire race, it might be, we're looking at average versus normalized power, and the differences there meaning the spikes. And so the more closer to 1 you are.
Well, yes. There's another issue though. In triathlon, you can there's a lot of low power periods.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily want to be riding even. You want to be riding efficiently. So it's in variable terrain. So every time, so that's also one of the reasons why I like athletes to be a little under geared, because when they run out of gears, I want them rolling zeros. Just a little bit of tension on the chain, because they're going fast enough. Because once the speed's up, the energy's going into the wind. I want that energy to go into the run instead. And so it's slightly different in the sense that you can get variability, but I want the variability on the downside.
Right.
So I don't want it on the upside.
Right,
so chop the peaks and then take as much free speed as you can manage, because you'll get it all back and more when you're running.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's those matches that you're talking about too.
Yeah.
How many matches did you go through? Actually, in WKO, it's kind of cool. There's a match feature where you can designate the matches. It'll go through the entire file and find every single match. Every time I did 300 to 350 for more than 8 seconds, go find them. It'll find all 50 of them.
Great feature.
Hey, how do people follow you? You've mentioned your website, Substack, YouTube. Where
easiest thing. So I got a personal landing page, 1000daypacing.com.
Yeah.
And it's the number. So it's like 1000 pacing.
Nice.
1000daypacing.com. That there's only 4 things that I do. I got YouTube, Twitter, and I've got 2 Substacks. So one Substack is called Endurance Essentials. It's what we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
And then there's another one called True Wealth, which is lessons that I've learned in my day job over the last 34 years.
Yeah, awesome.
Working with investments as well as wealthy families. I act as a fiduciary.
sell high or
Yeah. Well, if you read my stuff, you'll see. I've never been
compounding. No.
Compounding, I'm a big believer in all domains,
Yeah.
mainly because our brains are not set up to understand how powerful compounding is. I've been trained in it, and I'm still surprised every time.
Yeah. The marshmallow test with little kids? Isn't that like the original psychology test? Awesome. Wow. Lots of great stuff. This is all backed up in YouTube and Substack, like Gordo just mentioned. So go find him there. Awesome stuff. You put something out every single morning too. So a wealth of information coming from you. So I appreciate what little you've passed along to us today. And yeah, man, looking forward to it. And let's do an easy ride sometime.
Yeah, I like it.
Thanks, Gordo.
Okay, thanks, Dirk.
Thanks for listening to the TrainingPeaks CoachCast. Visit trainingpeaks.com for more training and coaching resources.